Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the FMCSA Clearinghouse update. This will be presented by DISA. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to write those down and submit them. We will be answering those all after the webinar in a separate email. I'd like to introduce Justin Mills, who will be presenting today's webinar. He has been with the DISA team since August of 2018 as a senior compliance specialist. He currently leads DISA's Clearinghouse implementation project, as well as the audit and monitoring program and the risk assessment program. He also supports DISA's clients with audit assistance and statistical reporting questions. Justin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know there's been a lot of questions surrounding the FMCSA Clearinghouse. What is it? What does it do? Who's required to participate? So we're just going to go ahead and jump right into the presentation, and we're going to try to clear up some of those questions for you and make sure that we address, who's responsible for what and what DISA will be able to do to support you all. So again, we'll be covering the FMCSA Clearinghouse basics. That will be the sort of the who, what, when, where of the clearinghouse itself. We'll be talking about what this means for employers. That would be our clients, DISA clients, and what employers should expect in 2020. So first, let's just cover what is the FMCSA Clearinghouse. What even is it, as they would say? It is an online database that will give FMCSA stakeholders real-time access to drivers' drug and alcohol program violations, negative return to duty tests, and completion of follow-up testing plans. This initiative was required by some congressional legislation that came out a few years ago called MAP 21. So in that legislation, it required the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or the FMCSA, to develop and maintain a clearinghouse to track this drug and alcohol violation information. It was created with the purpose of providing employers and other stakeholders efficient tools to identify drivers who are not eligible to perform safety-sensitive functions. As you may be aware, there's currently a process where employers of FMCSA CDL drivers are required to reach out to the previous safety-sensitive regulated employers of a driver over the last 3 years and reach out to those previous employers and determine if there's any drug and alcohol violation information for that driver, and to ensure that that driver went through the required return to duty process. So currently, a prospective employer of a CDL driver would actually have to reach out to a previous DOT regulated employer, regardless of the agency, even if they came from PHMSA or the Coast Guard or the FAA. If they're a CDL driver looking to perform CDL functions, they would actually have to reach out to those other employers as well and determine and ask if there's any drug and alcohol violation information that they need to be aware of. The issues with the current process is that the prospective employees do not always disclose previous employers where violations occurred. That means that if the prospective employee hasn't disclosed that they worked somewhere where there was a violation, obviously the prospective employer doesn't even know to reach out to that employer and get that information. So there's just a hole of information. There's a gap there that they're not able to address. Previous employers, even when a prospective employer does know to reach out to a previous employer, that previous employer doesn't always respond to the request. Sometimes they ignore it. Sometimes they just flat out reject it for other reasons. The result is that drivers that are unfit for duty are hired and placed behind the wheel of a truck, which puts their prospective employer and the public at risk. This new process under the clearinghouse will affect several industry stakeholders. So obviously employers of CDL drivers, the CDL drivers themselves. There are also requirements for medical review officers, or MROs. There are requirements for substance abuse professionals, or SAPs. There are requirements for the state driver's license agencies. So for Texas, that would be somebody like Texas Department of Public Safety. In your respective state, it may be a Department of Motor Vehicles or even a Department of Transportation, depending on the individual state. There are also some requirements for consortium or third-party administrators, which in this case for us is obviously DISA. The functions for each of these stakeholders will vary. Starting with the employers are required to perform pre-employment and annual queries on drivers, and they're required to report specific driver violations as needed. The drivers are required to provide electronic consent or reject, as the case may be, for both pre-employment and full queries, and they will also wind up providing consent directly to a employer for limited queries. They'll be able to review the accuracy of the reports in the clearinghouse. MROs will be required to report specific driver violations as needed. The SAPs will be reporting specific return to duty program information. The state driver's license agencies are going to be performing queries prior to completing licensing transactions. This piece has been delayed until 2023. The goal is, however, when a driver comes in to renew his CDL or to possibly even just change his address or update his medical card, the state driver's license agencies by 2023 will be actually be querying the clearinghouse to make sure that there are no unresolved drug and alcohol violations. If there's a drug and alcohol violation and the driver has not completed that return to duty process, then they would actually reject that transaction and they would not be eligible to maintain their CDL until that was corrected. CTPAs, such as DISA, may report violations or make queries on behalf of employers. So let's talk about queries. What is a query? A query is an electronic check in the clearinghouse to determine if current or prospective employees are prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions due to unresolved drug and alcohol program violations. This is, again, just intended to replace that inquiry to individual employers. Once employers start reporting all the information into the clearinghouse in 2023, you'll be able to do one query to the clearinghouse and retrieve all the drug and alcohol violation information for a driver from one location. There are two types of queries: a limited query, which satisfies the new annual query requirement, and full queries, which includes all pre-employment queries. All the queries will require driver consent, but the type of consent will depend on the query type, which we'll cover in just a second. Employers must purchase query credits directly from the clearinghouse in order to actually perform the query. The query credits cost $1.25 and they're used for both limited and full queries. You can buy them in bundles. Information on that is available from the clearinghouse. And it is important to note that the CTPAs, whether it's DISA or another CTPA, we cannot purchase those credits on behalf of an employer. They have to be purchased directly by the employer. So let's talk about those queries a little bit more. If you look at the limited query, first off, this graphic actually comes from the FMCSA itself. They worked up this great graph that actually really breaks down the query types very well. The limited query is used for annual checks on a currently employed driver or an ad hoc periodic check on a driver. So even though you're required to do one a year, you may be allowed to do a limited query more often if you so wish. Quarterly, you could even do it daily. As long as, if you look to the next column, as long as your limited consent form specifies the time range and the frequency, you can set that on your own, and you can do limited checks as often as every day. Consent is maintained outside the clearinghouse. It may be an electronic or a wet signature. You can maintain that electronically in your files, or you can maintain that as a paper, as a paper file in the driver qualification file. If the driver has not provided you consent to perform limited queries on at least an annual basis, then the query can't be conducted and the driver has to be removed from safety sensitive functions. So at any point, if a driver is refusing to allow you to do queries, they have to be removed from safety sensitive functions. If the consent is provided, you're going to retain that via paper or electronically in the driver's qualification file, and you'll be able to request a limited query in the clearinghouse. Now, if no records are found in the clearinghouse for that queried driver, there's no follow-up action that's required at that point. If there are records that are found in the clearinghouse for the queried driver, a full query is required at that point. You will need to conduct a full query based on the fact that the limited query has indicated that there are records to be reviewed in the clearinghouse for that specific driver. So a full query must be conducted for violation and or return to duty details. And if that full query is not conducted within 24 hours of the limited query, then the driver has to be removed from safety sensitive functions, including operating a CMV. So if you do a limited query on one of your drivers and the query indicates that there are records in the clearinghouse that need to be reviewed, if you wait too long to conduct that full query as a follow-up, that means you would then actually have to call that driver and then pull him off to the side of the road until you can finish the full query process. Now, the full query is required for pre-employment checks. It's required when a limited query returns records, or you can actually skip the limited on the ad hoc periodic check and just go straight to a full query if you wish. Now, the consent requirements differ from the limited in that the consent for a full query is managed entirely by the clearinghouse and it's entirely electronic. When you perform a full query, it's going to send an email to the driver indicating that you requested a full query, and it's going to tell them to log into the clearinghouse and provide that consent. One of the issues that will come up is if the driver has not registered for an account with the clearinghouse, they won't have an email address to send that driver an email. So they're going to take the address, the current address on their commercial driver's license and send them a letter, and they expect that process to take 10 to 14 days for that letter to get out to that driver. And that driver is then going to have to go on, register for the clearinghouse, and either provide or reject consent. If the driver refuses consent, then the employer will be notified of that refused consent. The query will not be able to be conducted, and the driver cannot perform or must be removed from safety sensitive functions. So in the sense of a pre-employment, if you do a pre-employment full query on a driver and they refuse, you cannot put that person in safety sensitive functions. You could technically hire them, but they would not be able to perform FMCSA functions for you. If they're already a driver for you and you've performed a full query and they've rejected it, they have to be immediately removed. As soon as you get that notification, you need to remove them from safety sensitive functions. If the consent is provided, you can continue with the query. The query will be conducted for you. The full violation and or the return to duty details will be released, if any. If the driver has a violation and there is no negative return to duty test result associated with that violation, that driver has to be removed from safety sensitive functions and then start that return to duty process. If a driver has no violations or a violation and a negative return to duty test, then there's no further action required. So let's review the consent just one more time. A pre-employment query is required to be a full query. A full query must be performed on all new hires starting January 6, 2020. A full query releases drug and alcohol violations to the prospective employer, and the drivers must provide electronic consent directly to the clearinghouse. The annual query can be limited, and it must be performed on each driver on an annual basis, either limited or full. The limited query only indicates if there's information to be reviewed, and for the limited queries, the employer maintains their own written or electronic consent for limited queries, and that consent for the limited is maintained outside of the clearinghouse. They do not maintain any records of a consent for limited queries. If they need proof of that, that will be done at a compliance review or a safety audit. Now, an annual query could be a full if you wish. Again, if the result of a limited query indicates there is information in the clearinghouse or you choose to go for a full, then that would be, again, an electronic process. Now, the initial note on the side, the initial annual query for drivers that already work for an employer prior to January 6, 2020, you must complete that initial annual query by January 5th of 20, that should say 2021, I apologize. But you have the entire year to actually do your initial annual query for existing drivers. Again, consent for full queries is managed electronically by the clearinghouse, not by the employer, not by a CTPA. It's entirely between the clearinghouse and the driver. An employer only needs to maintain written consent for limited queries. Drivers are required to provide consent for a full pre-employment query before performing safety-sensitive functions for the prospective employer, and drivers are required to provide consent for full annual inquiries within 24 hours of receiving the consent request from the clearinghouse, or they have to be removed from safety sensitive functions. Outside of queries, the employers are also required to start reporting certain violations. If you notice, there's a 3 business day time frame there. If you are notified of an alcohol result of 0.04% or greater, or a negative return to duty test result, a refusal to take an alcohol test, a refusal to take a drug test that does not involve the MRO, or a report that the driver has successfully completed all follow-up tests as prescribed by an SAP, or actual knowledge violations, you must report that to the clearinghouse within 3 business days. So if you're notified on Friday, you wouldn't count Saturday and Sunday in that three-day time frame. Now, actual knowledge, if you're not aware of what actual knowledge is, that is under Part 382. Actual knowledge is based on direct observation of the employee using alcohol or controlled substances, or a traffic citation for driving a CMV under the influence of alcohol or controlled substances. There are some parameters in there for when a driver admits to controlled substance use. Questions about driver self-admission should be directed to the FMCSA. It can get very complicated when determining what part of the regulations to apply when a driver self-admits to controlled substance uses. And given that complication, that is the one report that DISA will not be able to support reporting. There are some affidavits that would need to be signed and provided to the clearinghouse directly. Those violations tend to be rare, but in that case, that would actually have to be handled by the employer and not by DISA. The driver has the responsibility to provide consent. The driver needs to provide written general consent to the motor carrier for limited queries, and drivers need to respond to electronic consent queries from the clearinghouse. They'll also be able to access the information in the clearinghouse. So they'll be able to log in and they'll see what has been reported. They'll be able to look at the factual accuracy. They'll be able to challenge things like name spelling. Maybe the CDL number is wrong. Maybe the dates are wrong, but they won't actually be able to challenge the actual test result. In other words, they can't lodge a complaint with the clearinghouse and say that the MRO made the wrong determination in saying that this was a positive test, or that the collection site made the wrong determination in that it should not have been considered a refusal to test. Now, the MRO will report verified positive, adulterated, or substituted test results, and that's for controlled substances, not alcohol. They will report refusals to test requiring an MRO determination. The SAP, the substance abuse professional, reports identification of the driver and the date of an initial SAP assessment. So this is part of that return to duty process. Successful completion of treatment or education and the determination of eligibility for return to duty testing. Now, this doesn't require any additional actions by the employer. The MRO and the SAP make their own clearinghouse accounts. The employer does not have to designate the MRO or the SAP. Once they receive the information, they have a regulatory duty to report that information. Now, the drivers have to designate the SAP in the clearinghouse before they can submit a report, but the MRO does not need to be designated by an individual employer. CTPA may, but is not required to, make reports to the clearinghouse on behalf of an employer, and we may perform clearinghouse driver queries, both pre-employment and annual, on behalf of an employer. Now, if you note, there's an important asterisk. As usual with the FMCSA, there's usually exceptions built into the regulation somewhere. And for this case, it's going to be owner-operators. For owner-operators, they're required to designate a CTPA to administer their drug testing program and complete reporting to the clearinghouse when necessary. They can perform necessary queries to the clearinghouse on themselves. In other words, DISA does not have to perform this for them, but we do actually have to report for any owner-operator clients. We actually bear the regulatory responsibility to report on behalf of an owner-operator. Now, if there's any confusion about what an owner-operator is, under the FMCSA guidelines, they define that as someone who acts as both an employer and a driver at certain times. So an example would be someone who owns ABC Trucking, and the MCS 150 is registered in their name, and then they also hold a CDL, and then they also perform as a driver for ABC Trucking. In that instance, that individual, he or she is both the owner and the operator for that one entity. And in that instance, the FMCSA has said that individual must designate a CTPA to administer their drug testing and complete the necessary reporting to the clearinghouse. Moving forward, getting ready for 2020, employers should start preparing right now. There are some steps that we would highly suggest that you take. Number one, obviously, would be to register with the clearinghouse. Employers do need to register for a clearinghouse account. CTPAs cannot register that employer account for their clients. The employer has to register their own account, and the CTPA registers their own individual account as well. Instructions for registration are available at clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov. The clearinghouse has provided very well produced instructions for the registration process for all entities. So there will actually be, you will actually find on the clearinghouse website instructions for registering an employer, registering the drivers. The MRO has their own information. The SAP has their own information. There are job aids for all the different stakeholders that are very well put together. If an FMCSA employer plans to use a CTPA for clearinghouse compliance, they will need to designate that CTPA during the registration process. You'll need to ensure that DISA is aware of what company name is registered with the FMCSA, as it may not match your DISA account name. As an example, we're going to go back to ABC Trucking. Your name that FMCSA knows you by might be ABC Trucking, but DISA may know you as a client as Joe Smith Enterprises. So Joe Smith Enterprises owns ABC Trucking. As far as DISA is concerned, so far, we only know you as Joe Smith. So when we get the request to approve ABC Trucking, unfortunately, the clearinghouse has not provided us with a lot of identifiers for these companies. There's no email address, there's no phone number. They don't even show us the DOT number. We only get the name. So we would need to know what you're known to, what you're known by to the FMCSA, so that we can put those two entities together. You'll need to begin purchasing queries. In order to conduct those queries that are required starting January 6, 2020, you need to purchase those query credits that we mentioned earlier. The query bundles don't expire. They come in a variety of sizes. There are no discounts. Each query is still $1.25, but you can purchase them in bulk amounts. And information for that is found at clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov/query/plan. Employers should also begin encouraging their drivers to register for an account prior to January 6, 2020. That should be part of the onboarding process for prospective hires, but it should also be something that you're encouraging your current drivers to do as well. And the reason is because of the 24-hour deadlines that kick in when full queries are conducted. You want to make sure that your current drivers are ready, so that if that actually becomes necessary, you're not having to take people on the road because a 24-hour time frame was missed. It will make meeting that 24-hour deadline a lot easier. It will also streamline your processes when you're not waiting for people to actually go online and register for a clearinghouse account. Drivers will register at the same web address as employers, clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov. Now, if you designate DISA as your CTPA in the clearinghouse, you must also contact DISA in order for the appropriate changes to be made in your DISA Works account. So what that means is there are some account settings that need to be made to make sure that when a test that is required to be reported comes in under your client ID number, we need those settings to be activated so that it'll go to the work queue and that the appropriate team will have visibility to that and make sure that they can get that information off to the clearinghouse. Now, designating DISA as your CTP in the clearinghouse does not guarantee that we will report on your behalf. You must notify DISA in order for reports to be made. If we don't know that you've designated us, those account settings won't be changed, and we won't know to report that information when it comes in. Now, whether or not you designate DISA as your CTPA in the clearinghouse, you must provide driver and company information to DISA in order to maintain accurate FMCSA random drug and alcohol testing programs. And we'll cover that in a little more detail in just a minute. Starting January 6, 2020, you will be able to begin ordering full pre-employment queries through DISAWorks in the same manner as ordering other background products. If you already use us for background services, you will probably be aware of how that looks when you select different products. It will be a product just like the other background service products. Now, at this time, DISA does not perform queries on drivers automatically. A client will need to place orders through our background services in order for that to happen. If you've requested us to do so, DISA will report violations to the clearinghouse on your behalf. In order to meet the 3-day deadline for reporting violations, clients will need to be prepared for some interaction with DISA personnel in terms of making sure that we have accurate information to report to the clearinghouse. You may receive emails or phone calls that would be, it would be very important for you to respond to quickly. Also beginning January 6, 2020, all FMCSA drug and alcohol test forms must be completed using the driver's CDL number and state of issuance instead of any other identifier. There are no changes being made to the CCF, the ECCF, or the alcohol testing form. There's no need for that to change. The form has always allowed for employers to use whatever identifier they choose to use. It's just never been required to use the CDL before. And really quick on those annual queries, currently DISA Works does not notify users when annual queries are required. Clients will need to monitor the dates when the queries will be required internally until such features are developed. Annual queries for drivers that are already employed prior to January 6, 2020 will need to have an annual query, either full or limited, conducted prior to January 5th, 2021. DISA Works will offer the full queries as of January 6, 2020. The limited queries will be available at a slightly later date. Now, all DISA clients with FMCSA policies must provide the following information, and this is regardless of whether you have opted to use us as your CTPA and have us make those reports on your behalf. We need to have the driver's CDL number and state of issuance, especially. We would also need the driver's date of birth, the company DOT numbers for each FMCSA policy and location, and confirmation of your status as an owner-operator. If you're an owner-operator, we do need to know that so that we can make sure that we're in compliance and that you're in compliance as well. Now, the key here really is the driver's CDL number and state of issuance for all of our clients. We are going to have to start matching the CDL number and state of issuance to the employee record rather than a social security number or any other employee ID. So it's very critical that we get that information. DISA clients will be receiving an email later this week that will have information on how to contact client support for assistance in updating driver records if necessary or performing roster loads. And going forward, as mentioned earlier, it is required that you start to use the CDL number and the state of issuance as the identifier on the federal forms for the FMCSA test. You're not required to use the driver's license for PHMSA, for Coast Guard, for FAA, FRA, any of those other agencies. Only for FMCSA are you required to use the driver's license number. You do need to utilize the 2-digit state code as well. And as an example, if you look at this graph, you see that the state code for Texas is, of course, TX and the number 1234567 On the CCF, when you're processing a test through DISA, you would need to enter that TX directly in front with no space, the 1234567 so that it reads TX 1234567 You can see Colorado's example, but we'll skip down to Washington because it's one of the most unique. If you see Washington state code is WA, the CDL number is ABCD asterisk 12345. That is actually a Washington driver's license. It's based off of an actual Washington driver's license. The state code WA goes right in front of that A. So WA ABCD asterisk 12345. And you can see a similar situation with the North Dakota example. And these are all based off of actual CDL numbers that we have examples of so that we can actually show you this is what's required to be in there. The reason that this is important is because once tests are being processed through DISA Works, we're going to need to make sure that we have a uniform way to read that number and then match it to an employee record. This is just an example CCF completed with CDL and the CDL state of issuance. As you can see, I used the Washington example from the previous slide. So WA ABCD asterisk 12345. If you can see my cursor right here by C, donor SSN or employee ID number, and then we've entered the 2-digit state code and then the CDL number exactly as it appears on the license. So just to review the suggested steps that an employer should take to prepare: 1, register with the clearinghouse. 2, designate a CTPA if desired. 3, purchase query plans. 4, encourage your drivers to register. We also encourage you to make that part of your onboarding process with prospective hires if they're not already registered with the clearinghouse. When they come to you, ask them to do that as part of the process. Notify DISA that you've designated us as a CTPA in the clearinghouse. Provide that necessary information to us. And then starting in 2020, you'll begin performing queries, reporting violations. Those are things that we may be doing for you on your behalf if you've designated us and notified us. And then, of course, starting January 6, 2020, you will need to complete the CCF, the ECCF, and the ATF with a CDL and a CDL state of issuance. So really briefly, what should employers expect in 2020? This is a flow chart that I've put together to kind of help you get a high level view of what your hiring process will look like and what your ongoing maintenance will look like. So application for employment, then the pre-employment clearinghouse inquiry, the pre-employment drug test. Now, those don't have to be in that order. You can perform either of those before the other. You can do the drug test first and then the clearinghouse query. The regulations don't care which order you do them in, as long as you've done both of those before that driver starts performing safety sensitive functions. So you would not want to be in a position where you did a pre-employment drug test and then they started driving a truck and then the pre-employment clearinghouse query came after they've already been on the road. You'll continue doing the previous employer drug and alcohol queries, the one where you reach out to the actual previous employers, until January 2023. And then you'll obtain the limited consent for annual queries from the driver. And then all the other DQ file requirements will still apply, such as motor vehicle records, a road test, commercial driver's license copies, things of that nature. Maintain those records in the DQ file or other appropriate file. And then you'll continue to monitor your driver qualification files and continue to monitor your drug and alcohol program. For the annual and ongoing requirements, you'll be performing the annual clearinghouse queries, either limited or full, the other annual DQ requirements like annual motor vehicle records, and then you'll report drug and alcohol violations to the clearinghouse if needed, or DISA will do that if you've opted to do so. And if the driver's terminated, you'll need to make sure that you maintain the records for the required time. Some of those vary, some of the retention times vary depending on the record. All that information will be maintained in the record, maintained in the DQ file or other appropriate file. And again, you're going to want to do continual monitoring of your DQ files and continual monitoring of your drug and alcohol program. Now, it's important to note that there is no application programming interface or API for the clearinghouse. That's an IT term that essentially means there's no ability to automate any of these functions in the clearinghouse. There's no automated reporting, there's no automated queries. All tasks must be completed manually by interacting directly with the clearinghouse website. Now, the one good thing is, and we didn't cover it because we were trying to stick to the basics, you are able to do batch queries. You would have to put them in a specific Excel file format called a TSV, and you can upload 100 drivers or so into the clearinghouse, and they'll run each one. But that's about as automated as it gets, is putting some stuff into an Excel file and then submitting that to the clearinghouse and then having them run those sort of behind the scenes for you rather than entering them into the clearinghouse one by one. But in terms of actually just automating the report, like clicking a button on your end or at DISA Works or at any other CTPA, there's nothing that actually automates those functions. It's all manually. You have to go direct to the clearinghouse website. And they've said that at this time, they're not planning on automating any features. They may revisit that later on down the road, but right now they needed to meet certain security parameters set by the federal government. Now, it is important to note that we cannot operate as your CTPA. DISA cannot operate as your CTPA unless you are a DISA client. So if you want us to make reports, we would need to actually have an FMCSA drug and alcohol policy. If we're not processing your drug tests, we won't be able to make reports on your behalf. If you want us to perform queries, you would need to be signed up for background services, and we would need our DQ service to help track the pre-employment and annual query compliance. There are some potential difficulties that we will face in January, both DISA and clients and employers just in general. This is going to be industry-wide. The new requirement to use CDL numbers could cause roster duplication errors. Understand, of course, if you've been using the Social Security number as the record, the employer record ID, once we start processing tests with the CDL numbers, if there's a mismatch there, what DisaWorks will do is potentially create a duplicate record for that employee. So it's really important that we get that CDL number for those employees prior to January 6, 2020, and that you get that information updated, because it will reduce the potential for roster errors. Again, identification of clients in the clearinghouse is sometimes difficult depending on what we know our clients as compared to what the FMCSA knows our clients as. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that. We may know somebody as Joe Smith Enterprises, and they may be known to the FMCSA as ABC Trucking. That's completely legitimate. We're just not aware of that change. And again, we're not given any other identifiers. We're not given the DOT number. We're not given the email or any other contact information for these employers. So we're really having to work to scrub those lists of requests and make sure we reach out to everyone and identify who those clients are that have identified us as being their TPA in the clearinghouse. You could have some delayed queries due to lack of driver consent. That may be because they're not registered with the clearinghouse, or they're just ignoring their email. It's a variety of things. So just understand that, if you perform a full query on a driver and they don't consent within a time frame, you're going to be required to pull that driver off the road. So one of our suggestions is to be very communicative with the drivers when you do a full query and let them know, I've just asked for a full query. You need to be watching your email so that you can provide that consent and we don't have to pull you off the road. I think most drivers would probably be open to that. They're not on the road. A lot of times they're not making money either. So they're definitely going to want to stay working as much as possible. You could see delayed queries due to lack of query credits available. While DISA cannot order query bundles for our clients, we do see what your balance is. So we will be trying to keep you aware of when there's no query credits available and make sure that that's worked out. The clearinghouse will be sending notifications to employers when their balance is low. We have not been told what the trigger is for that notification. It may be a percentage, so that if you order 1,000 queries, perhaps it gives you an email at 10%. So once you get down to 100, it gives you an email, but they have not specified what that notification actually looks like. So please expect to work closely with us and with DISA in 2020 in order to ensure a smooth implementation. Again, we've been working very hard to try to keep up with this and to be in front of this to support our clients. But just understand the clearinghouse final rule was published in 2016, but we did not get any details about the actual operation of the system until early 2019. So we've been working very hard to stay on top of this, and we will be working closely with you in 2020 to ensure that smooth implementation. So please start preparing now. If you have any questions about the clearinghouse regulations and implementation, that should be directed to the FMCSA at 855-368-4200 or through the website listed on your screen. Questions about DISA accounts, DISA products, or adding driver information should be directed to client support at the number and email address listed. Questions about this specific presentation can be directed to compliance@disa.com. You can put attention Justin or just put clearinghouse in the subject and it'll get directed to me. If you do not have an FMCSA drug testing policy, or you need background services or DQ services with DISA and you're interested in obtaining those services, please contact sales@disa.com. And that will conclude my presentation for today. Again, if you have any questions, please submit those online. We will follow up with those offline through email. Thank you.